Good evening. Welcome back to The Bible Speaks Today from LBC Television Ministries. For you, it's been just a week since you last heard me going on about things. For me, it's been 2 or 3 weeks. We've had some vacations and things like that within the team. One of our key people decided to go to New Orleans for a couple of weeks. Took forever to get him back. And several other people had vacation, before, I guess, trying to get fall break over with or whatever it is. Anyway, it's been 3 weeks. And that's awkward for me because, instead of coming straight in after another program, and if you've been watching these programs regularly, that we record 2 back to back and then there's a week break and record another 2. And when it's a long break, it's sort of, I'm getting old, it's kind of hard to remember where I left off. I mean, all right, I've got my notes and things, but it's somewhat difficult to know where I left off. And then since you saw me last, I've done a marathon bicycle ride and 1 or 2 other things, and generally got my brain shaken up. All right, whatever. So I'm glad you're back with me. And before we get into this fairly intensive discussion on well, it's not really a discussion, is it? Because you're not saying anything. I get to do all the talking. But this fairly presentation, let's call it that, on the Bible before the English Bible, the King James and various others. I thought I might mention something that is unique. Remember, I started the program off by saying there were 3 great religions where a book was the key point of it, or the focal point of it. In Judaism, of course, it's the Torah. In Islam, it's the Quran. And of course, in the case of Christianity, it's the Bible. And of those 3, it's kind of interesting to note that whereas the Torah is basically the same as it was during the time of Christ, and the Quran is not altered since it was put together by Muhammad, and is virulently defended against change, the Bible has gone through a myriad of translations and changes. I mean, even now the Quran is not allowed, I'm sure it's happened, but the Quran is not allowed to be, certainly not by its believers, to be translated out of the original Arabic. And of course the Torah is in Hebrew, although I believe there are some translations of it. But the Bible, of course, is in every tongue almost in the world. It's kind of an interesting thing to think about. So, thinking about that, where we pick up from where I left last time was that I had said that after the Jerome had translated the Bible into Latin, which commonly known as the Vulgate version, that there was felt no need to do any more. That Jerome was a sainted author, and we had it in Latin, and the priests could understand it. Well, that's not necessarily true. A majority of priests could understand it, and most people at that time, medieval England, had an acquaintance with the Bible. In other words, they knew what it was, and of course they knew what it said because they were told by the priests. But there was no real need for anybody to want to read it. I mean, if you're not taught to read and write, then you don't look for anything to read, do you? If you're content to just, go about your daily business and get the message, whatever it may be, from somebody else. It's like the laws. I mean, there were laws in England, in medieval England, written down in great big books. You only got to go to London and look in some of the museums and libraries there, and there's copies of all these, the books, like the famous Doomsday Book that William the Conqueror had, the list of all, basically an inventory of England. It's all down there, but only very few people could read it. And most people wouldn't be interested. If somebody said, hey, it says in a Doomsday Book you've got 2 barns and 5 sheep, okay, well, that's what it says. I would not know what 2 barns and 2 sheep look like written down. So the illiterate majority, which is England, felt that they would have no need for a book. And the educated minority would be very adverse to having any changes to the established status quo. I mean, this went on for 7 or 8 centuries, not just a couple of hundred years. I mean, it just went on and on and on. People just didn't want to change things. I mean, if you're the ruling class, whatever class that may be, or whatever governorship, you may be, and you've got the rule book, and you're the only one who knows what it says, and you can interpret that any which way you want because nobody's going to contradict you, it puts you in a very powerful position legally. I mean, when in the rare occasions when peasants or uneducated people brought a case to an assize court or something, the interpretation of whatever the law was read by the judge or the learned lawyer who could read and nobody else could. So it was basically, whatever they said, you went along with. It's a bit like today, if you like. I'm trying to think of a simile. If the only people who could read the Constitution were the senators and congressmen in government, and the rest of us just went along with what they said. Well, that's too close to what it's really like, isn't it? But imagine if it was like that. We had no idea what the Constitution said because we couldn't read it. And once you know what the Constitution says, I mean, there's nothing so annoying to a lawyer as a client who also understands the law. Are you with me? I mean, if you can say, no, it doesn't say that, it says this. Oh, well, yeah, okay, you can interpret that way if you want to. So you see the point. So for 7 or 8 centuries, nobody knew anything, right? And a lot of people felt too, and I can understand this to a certain extent, that the Bible shouldn't be read by common people. It was precious. It was holy. It was, we don't want common people pouring their grubby hands all over it and misunderstanding things. No, we want to keep it, pristine and unchanged. And the other thing was, of course, that it would require a certain amount of specified learning for you to make it reading. So it was important to have an authoritative reading of the Bible as to have the Bible itself. In other words, we don't want this getting into the hands of other people. Imagine, going back to the Constitution again, if, the gentleman in Washington had written a Constitution, and with all the safeguards and laws that, the habeas corpus, free speech, practice of religion, all those rights that we all take for granted. Imagine, if you will, that the vast majority of America could not read. Now, there certainly was a lot of illiteracy around in America at that time, but it wasn't the vast majority of people were illiterate, okay? The vast majority of people could read something. Imagine if they could not read the Constitution. So therefore their rights were all there, but people didn't give them to them, and they didn't know that they could gain them. One of the things about reading the Bible, as we will find as we go through this, is that people were absolutely amazed at what it said that applied to them. It wasn't a book of ponderous religious sayings. It was a book of life, a guide, this is what you should do, this is what you should not do, this is what people should not do to you, this is what you should do for other people. People up till then had just taken whatever the local priest said. And I'll be perfectly honest, during those 6 or 7 centuries, or 8 centuries, a lot of what we would call the local pastor, at the local priest level, the priest at the local church, probably couldn't read half the Bible themselves anyway. They learnt it by rote, by heart. Okay, so and you've got to mean that at the same time as this is all happening, Anglo-Saxon English, not the American Anglo-Saxon, but the original Anglo-Saxon, which is quite different from English today. There's a very interesting, if you go on the internet and look up for Anglo-Saxon, somewhere on one of the websites there's some passages of literature in Anglo-Saxon and then in modern English. And it's like a foreign language. I mean, you can recognize the odd word or two, but Anglo-Saxon was really quite strange. But anyway, when at that time people were doing this, as I said, trying to keep the Bible from being read by too many people so they wouldn't get confused, as you say, you understand the language itself was changing. Anglo-Saxon wasn't a language until quite well into the 1200s, 1100s, 1200s. because there were so many things in it. I mean, it was originally, they spoke Celtish, then the Romans had their influence, and then the Danes had their influence, and half a dozen other people had their influence, the French as well. So the actual language of England was constantly changing, and it hadn't been formalised at this point in time. So when people started saying we need the Bible in English, or we need to have it in a language we can understand, there was tremendous opposition. One of the biggest cases, and it was kind of a good case to go on, was, hey, we don't even have a formalised language yet, so how can you want to translate it? That was a big one. The second thing was that if Latin had been good enough for centuries, why cheapen the Bible by a translation? Bearing in mind, mind you, that the Bible at that time, the Latin, was a translation of the Greek, which was a translation of the Aramaic. Okay, people when they argue things sometimes forget the ground rules. Okay, I mean, there'd grown up a big feeling that not only were the Bible writers inspired, which of course we even subscribe to today, but that Jerome himself, the translator, had been inspired. And I mean, he'd actually been canonized, on his way to sainthood. He probably is a saint, I don't know. But anyway, he was really, somebody they thought highly of. And if you read some of the references I looked at in doing this research, he's referred to as the inspired translator. So any criticism of his version, and by criticism we don't mean, oh, he got it wrong, but wanting to translate it into another tongue was literally considered impious or even profane. Tremendous opposition. And as I said, it's one of the ironies of Bible history that the version for which Jerome himself, the Vulgate, had to fight and was considered a piece of profanity when it was first discovered or first written, actually now becomes the battleground on which people are fighting about to keep it the same and not change it to anything new. When they're fighting against another version, saying that any other version than Jerome's version would be a sin against God. We pick up on things, human beings. We pick up and we say, "Oh, this is the way it is." Even today, people will hang their hats on the King James translation of the Bible, and there are many Protestant faiths, groups, if you will, who literally hang their hat on the King James being the inerrant word of God, when in fact the King James is so far removed from the original as far as translations goes, not as far as the meaning goes. It's like having a pair of Levi's made by Levi Strauss himself and copying them with another piece of denim and saying these are the original, and making 1,600 million copies and picking one at the end of the production line saying this is the Levi Strauss denim. Well, of course it's not. It's a copy of a copy of a copy. Well, my theories about that. But anyway, having said all that, so here we are. People want the Bible in the language. Now, you can understand, and this wasn't a huge movement. This wasn't the whole national populace clamouring to have a Bible in English. Most of the populace could have cared less. They were happy getting it the way they were from the parish priest, this sort of thing. Religion wasn't as organised, as we call it today. People just went to church and accepted what the priest said and went on and lived their lives. But there were groups of people who felt like it should be in the vernacular, in the local language. Okay. So when did we first start seeing this? Well, surprisingly enough, it was around in the 700 AD time. There was a singer. Now, this is not a rock and roll singer, not a pop star, although I suppose for his time he was. His name was Caedmon, and he lived in around 700 something. And he was one of these people who went around the different villages and sang the old war songs and things like that, much like the old balladeers in America went around and sang the folk songs of in the old times, not Peter, Paul and Mary and Paul Simon, but a few hundred years ago. The people who went around and sang the songs of old England and that sort of thing. Well, Caedmon had learnt by rote to paraphrase the Bible and put it into song. So he would sing verses of the Bible as stories in the Bible. He would sing them, which is kind of an interesting concept, isn't it? But he was quite famous for doing that. There's a gentleman called Bede. He's always called Bede. He's always called the Venerable Bede because he was a great scholar, helped to found Oxford University. But he tells us a story about how he came to this power of inspiration. It's actually one of the best stories in literature. Bede himself, I think, was a child when Caedmon died, but he was Caedmon was a peasant, farm labourer in Northumbria, that's in the north of England, working on the lands at Whitby Abbey, which is still there today actually. And he was middle-aged. He hadn't shown any particularly sparks of genius or anything like that. Like his mother said, oh, from when he was a child he sang. No, he didn't. But he liked to go to the festivals that they used to have, the May Day festivals, things like that, and hear the singers, the performers, sing their improvised songs. Well, now, bear in mind, everybody learned everything by heart. There wasn't any writing down the sheet music. Oh, that sounds pretty good. Can I have the sheet music? Like we do today. No, I mean, people learned it by heart. But when it came for his turn, I mean, what they used to do with these things, you'd all sit around like a Scottish ceilidh, and people would give you the harp, because no guitars in those days, just a harp, and you'd play a harp and maybe make up a song or something like that, something we should try to do today, right? But anyway, when it came to him, he always left, because he couldn't sing and he didn't know how to play music, so he always left. It's said, the story is that one night after he slipped away and done his rounds of the cattle or whatever he was supposed to be looking after, and he fell asleep in the stable building, and he heard a voice telling him to sing. And he said, I can't sing. So the voice said, no, you can sing. He said, what shall I sing? I don't know what to sing. He said, well, sing of the first beginning of created things. And the word came from him, and he started to sing from Genesis, like a hymn, if you will. And in the morning he tells his story, and the lady abbess, the woman who ran the abbey there, thought he had this divine gift. And what they found out was that if the monks translated little bits of the Bible out of Latin, which he did not, of course, understand, into his Anglo-Saxon tongue, not whole tracts of it, but just different lines, he would put it into measures, musical measures, rough musical measures. It would sound pretty awful to us today, but it probably was good for its time. And it could be sung by common people. So, as far as we can tell, the Bible became current in Anglo-Saxon speech, just in a small way, okay? Bede himself, the Venerable Bede, did in fact put the Gospel of John into Anglo-Saxon. At the Bodleian Library in Oxford, I had the great privilege and great expense of attending Oxford University. The Bodleian Library in Oxford University, there's a manuscript there, a medieval manuscript. I think it's about 20 or 30,000 lines, which is a lot, which is a metrical chant version of the Gospel and the Acts, done in 1250 by a gentleman called Alm, I think. Anyway, I know it's called the Omnium, and it's after him anyway. Okay, and there were around other these metrical chanting versions, verses, if you like, sung or spoken of the various parts of the Bible. Somewhere in between there, between Bede and Orm, there is a poem by Langland called The Vision of Piers Plowman. Some of you may have come across that during your university studies, or in your school, I don't know. But it paraphrased a lot of the scripture. It was very much the scriptures in a paraphrased turn, all right? So, yeah, but even then, with all these little bits around, there was no prose. Now, I'm not going to explain the difference between prose and metrical, I'm sure you know that, version of the Bible in the English language. It just wasn't there. I mean, as I said a few moments ago, there's only just beginning to be an English language. It was still, half French. Most people spoke French in court, or Latin in the church, and various dialects, of course, in parts of the country. Things even today, phrases and sayings mean different things in different parts of this country. In England, still the same, and back then, in the medieval times, very much so. But it was gradually taking shape, this Anglo-Saxon, and it was beginning to stand out from the Norman French Saxon, which is, as I said, what everybody spoke. And in fact, of course, much of it is rooted. Many of the English words that we use today are rooted in French words. I mean, that's not a surprise, everybody knows that. But what you've got to understand is, as soon as a language becomes definite enough, in other words, as soon as people start putting things down in the local language and not using the original Norman French or something, two things happen, guaranteed. Okay? First, that somebody would want to attempt to make a colloquial version of the Bible. In other words, let's translate the Bible or the holy books into a language everybody can understand. And secondly, 50% of the people would oppose it. Guaranteed. I mean, these two groups, for the translation of the Bible and against the translation of the Bible, from way back in the 1st, 2nd century, have marched together through history, side by side, both vehemently proclaiming that God is on their side, right? Okay? And it's the same with men. Men are some men propose things, other men oppose things. It's kind of the way it goes, okay? I mean, when Wycliffe, and we talked about Wycliffe in one of our previous programs, when he first of all cast the Bible into the modern language, okay, English of the day. And bear in mind, we're not talking about the King James Bible. We're years, 100, 200 years earlier than that. It was said, one of the criticisms of it, and I'll read it out to you, it's kind of interesting, that he had for sure translated the gospel into the Anglic tongue, but that it had thereby been made vulgar by him, and more open to the reading of laymen and women than it is usually to the knowledge of lettered and intelligent clergy. And thus the pearl is cast aboard and trodden under the feet of swine. And that we may not be in any doubt who the swine are, he adds, the jewel of the church is turned into the common of the people. So we had the haves, the upper class, considering that a translation of the holy book into the local language, because obviously we're upper class, we speak French or Latin or whatever was concurrent at the time. And now they want to turn it into this guttural Anglo-Saxon language which didn't even exist when we first came here, that sort of thing. And it's kind of that way today when you start talking about Bible translations. We'll talk about that in another program, but people don't want what they accept as the standard changed for any reason. The criticism of Wycliffe here is that, yes, he did translate it into the Anglic tongue, into Anglo-Saxon. Wow, what an achievement. But look, he's made it so common that it's not serious anymore. It's not, because everyone can read it, it's not the holy, upstanding book it was, which is really laughable when you think about it, considering that today, hundreds of years later, we not only consider it as holy as it used to be, we even are more interested in getting it translated so that more people can read it. It's an interesting scenario. the strong-minded men who wanted to translate the Bible, have two things in common. One is their love of the Bible and their belief in it, and the second was the sense that there was a need in their own time that the Bible needed to be read by more people. They, in their time, thought, with the wars and the countries fighting each other and this sort of thing, that there was a need for the Bible to be made more accessible to the ordinary man in the street. I mean, back then the king said, "Oh, I'm unhappy with these, we're going to attack these, form the army, here we go." Okay, and people just went. I mean, the king said so. Nobody said, "Well, is this ethical? I mean, do we have any really right to go over there and kill these people?" You know, the Bible tends to make you think that there's, hang on, should we be doing this? And of course the powers that be didn't want the lower class thinking for themselves now, did they? Okay. Wycliffe and Tyndale, who were the two big translators of the Bible into English, and are more than 100 years apart, don't get them confused, they were a long way apart, were chiefly moved to do what they did by the social conditions at the time in the country they were in. And we've run out of time, so we'll pick this up next week. Until then, every time you read your Bible, and I hope you do on a regular basis, remember what it's been through to get to where you are now. God bless.